All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, good morning. Hope you're having a great day. My name is Tyler Braun. I'm the Director of Financial Planning with the Trinell Financial Group. Very excited to be talking with you today. I can't think of a better term than making sense of the moment. Jen is the president of the Trinell Financial Group. We sat down and when we were putting this together. It's based on a lot of questions that we're getting from clients, right? This is a time where there's a lot of change that's occurring and making sense of the moment is just a great theme to carry into the first part of 2025. And that's what we want to do. We want to bring clarity to some of the questions that clients have. Like every good presentation, we want to start with an agenda. So we're going to be going through really 4 bullet points, and we're going to also be wrapping it up at the end, talking about some different strategies and opportunities to be looking at, right? Just because it's a time of change doesn't mean that there's not opportunity that comes from change if you're positioned correctly. So we're going to be talking about tariffs in detail. Also, we're going to be talking about unemployment. We're hearing that more and more in the news. There's possibly some tax changes that are going to be coming down the pipeline. We're going to talk about the statistics behind those tax changes and what they mean for you and also what they mean for the economy. And then obviously interest rates as well. That's been something that's been top of mind. Remember, interest rates are tied to inflation. That's something that's been top of mind for quite some time. So just as a reminder, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, this is a live webinar. So on the bottom of the screen, if you do have a question and we have time, I'm happy to go through that question in detail with you. So on the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tab that you can click. You can type that question in. Jenna, who's the president of our company, she's on this webinar as well. She'll be able to read that question, relay it to me, so we can go through it in detail. So once again, if you have a question as we go through, please ask it as I'm happy to go through it as long as time allows. In addition to that, just a reminder, right? I'm talking strictly on the statistics and the finances behind this, right? I know there's um, a lot of emotion that can be tied to politics right now. I am by no means getting political during this webinar. We're talking finances and statistics, and how it relates to your portfolio and you individually. So with that being said, we're going to get started. So the first piece we're touching on is tariffs, and I know you see a whole lot of ink on the screen here. The reason you see a lot of ink is there's a lot of tariffs that have been announced over the past month. We did a webinar just over 30 days ago, and there was talks of tariffs originally on Canada and Mexico, and also on China at that time. You can see since that time, not only has President Trump announced the tariff, we had a 30-day reprieve on tariffs that were announced originally. And now we've seen those tariffs put into place. So a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. We've also seen originally an additional 10% tariff on China, which has now been increased an additional 10%, so a 20% tariff on China's products, any imports from China in certain sectors. And then if you listen to the State of the Address from President Trump earlier this week, he referred to and talked about reciprocal tariffs. So starting next month, they're looking to implement a reciprocal tariff. And what that means is if a country is applying a tariff to the United States on goods, we are going to excuse me, we're going to reciprocate and charge that same tariff to that country on any of the products that they're importing. So it is a reciprocal tariff, just exactly as it sounds. He also alluded to the European Union and the trade deficit that the United States has with the European Union in implementing a tariff on those countries. Just as a reminder of those of you that are hearing that term tariff, and you're wondering, what is that, right? A tariff is basically a tax on something that we're importing from that country, right? And it's in the past been used as a negotiating tool to create more of a free trade back and forth or a levied playing field, right? So if we're importing products from another country, right? In this example, if we're importing a product from China, let's say, and there's a 20% tariff on that product, what that means is the company that is purchasing that product is paying a 20% tax on that, right? And that can be passed on to the consumer. It could be handled by the business itself, right? But it's typically a short-term increase in cost which can lead to short-term inflation. And that's something we hear about in the news quite a bit. So tariffs are very real. And tariffs are here. We've been talking about tariffs for over a year in preparation of this moment. Okay. As you can see on the screen listed here, right? The Trump tariffs that he just put into place recently, you can see the light gray area on the screen. If you can see my cursor as I'm moving, this was 2018 and 2019. And you can see this was the start of Trump's tariffs, but the most recent proposal would increase the tariffs to the highest level we've seen since 1939. Now, historically, right, historically, as you can see, the last 3 decades have been the lowest level of tariffs in our nation's history, right? Historically, our nation has had about a 30% tariff on other countries when importing products. The last almost 3 decades, we've had historically low tariffs, averaging right around that 2 to 6% rate, the lowest ever. We're starting to see those increase. This would be the highest level we've seen since 1939. So this is absolutely a change. And remember, with change comes anxiety, and with anxiety can come volatility. And that's what we're starting to see here in the short term. Estimated impact from President Trump's proposed tariffs, right? So a lot of people say, right, we're sitting down knee to knee, we're in a meeting, and I'm sitting across from the client. They're saying, well, I hear these tariffs, but what does it mean for me, right? What does it mean for the investments that we're in? How am I going to feel that day to day? What this did, and this is directly off the Tax Foundation. So this is directly off governmental sites where they're running proposed estimations on the tariffs that are already announced. The Chinese tariffs, the tariffs that we've put into place for China, would decrease our GDP by about 0.1%. The Canada tariffs that we've put into place would decrease our GDP 0.1%, Mexico 0.1, the euro 0.2. You can see the aluminum and steel, and then obviously the motor vehicles and so forth, especially tied to Canada, how much impact that sector would have on us as well. If you add all of those together, it's somewhere between a 0.5 and a 0.7% reduction of GDP if nothing changed. And that's something we're going to talk about here. In many ways right now, we're having trouble as a whole, it's very difficult to see the forest through the trees, right? And what I mean by that is there's different proposals that are being placed in the future that are set to offset some of the impacts that the tariffs are here right now. Those have not been passed yet. And that's also what's creating anxiety and volatility in the short term. But just note, tariffs, right, in the short term are going to have an impact on GDP. Hence, we're seeing some of the volatility that we're seeing, right? Tariffs can also have impact on jobs, right? Because if consumers are purchasing less products, because ultimately it's more expensive, then that can lead to a reduction in workforce hours, which is a reduction in jobs, and that also leads to higher unemployment rates in some circumstances. So these are absolutely things we need to continue to pay attention to. It's things that we here at the Trinnell Financial Group are watching very, very closely, but there is an impact from those tariffs on the economy. This is a slide we showed last webinar, which just was estimating the impact from a real GDP standpoint and inflation standpoint that tariffs can have. And the majority of the impact is in the short term. And the reason for that being is if you're a US company and you're importing your product from another country and all of a sudden a tariff is applied, you now need to look for different distribution channels, possibly inside the United States or through other countries where a tariff is not in place, and that takes time. So that's why you see the biggest hit to tariffs be in the short term. Same thing with inflation. So this is just a different way of showing the negative impact that tariffs can have on the short term from a GDP standpoint. So very similar to what I had talked about before. It's about a 0.1% impact with the Chinese retaliation on the US economy. You can see China is hit much more significantly on a growth impact, right? They're selling a lot of their products to the United States. If we're not purchasing as many products from them, that is a dramatic impact on their economy from the Chinese scale. Same thing with inflation. US inflation would shoot up slightly Chinese inflation would jump almost 3 times what the US economy would during that time period due to the tariffs. Canada and Mexico are very similar, right? They rely heavily on the purchase or the United States purchasing their goods, right? So the United States has a trade deficit with Canada of over $200 billion. That means that Canada is relying heavily on us purchasing those goods for them to drive their economy. If we're purchasing less of their product because it's more expensive due to the tariff, you can see the impact that it has on Canada's GDP as well as Mexico's GDP, much more significant than the overall United States GDP just because we're so much larger. Similar conversation with regards to the inflation impact, right? Obviously, the United States would have a small increase in inflation. Mexico and Canada would be hit much more significantly. So, with all of those being said, you're going to continue to see negotiations had by all parties. You're going to see retaliatory tariffs that occur. You're going to see negotiations where possible products or sectors are removed from that tariff issue. But as I said before, which we're going to talk about later, we have to continue to look forward past this time, right? This is step one that we're seeing with tariffs. There's going to be more tariffs, but we're also going to see tax changes and things like that that can also help offset the cost of those tariffs for corporations and for individuals, and also could lead to additional opportunities for additional growth to make the United States companies a little bit more competitive if they do pass that tax bill. Okay. So that's tariffs, right? That's tariffs. Tariffs as a whole do have a short-term hit to GDP. They do create anxiety. They do create a little bit of chaos. And what I mean by that is it changes distribution channels. It changes where people are purchasing goods. There's a short-term increase in cost. All of these different things are what you're seeing in the market right now. And we're going to talk about the markets here in just a second and where they're at. But that's what's leading the charge on the volatility that we're seeing. Now, the second piece that you're hearing in the news all the time is unemployment and layoffs. You can't read a news article right now and not see something come up about DOGE or layoffs or federal employees in particular being laid off in large numbers, right? And now the human element, you hate to see people lose their job, 100%, right? And as I said, we're only talking about the finances and the statistics during this piece. Layoffs as a whole in large numbers, right, is not a good thing for the economy because we see less income coming into individuals. Obviously, if they have less income coming into individuals, there's less spending that's occurring, right? Think about it. If you are fully employed as an economy, and you have people that are, and there's more jobs available than people, right? We see wage increases occur and we see spending occur. We saw some of this after 2020, where people started to look for new jobs. The economy was expanding and growing. We saw wage increases go up exponentially. When we see layoffs occurring, typically wage increases decrease, spending also starts to decrease. Okay. Also ties into the GDP and what we're looking at going forward. So as you can see, the bullet points that are on here on the left, as of the end of February, there were 172,017 layoffs that were announced. That was up 245% from January. That's a big number. That's actually the highest number. Challenger did the statistics on this. That's the highest number we've seen on a monthly difference since July of 2020, and that was the COVID era during that time period. So that's a huge jump, right? That's a huge jump in layoffs. Now, this is where the statistics, and this is where you hear that number and you cringe a bit because you're saying, oh my gosh, a 245% increase month over month, that's a huge number. Yes, but more than a third of those did come from governmental jobs, right? So that's the anomaly. It's not that the broader economy just dropped off. It was that there was some large layoffs that occurred at the federal level. Now, that's not me making small of that, but what I'm saying is it's not the broader economy that drove that. It was a rule that took place, and we saw a large decrease in overhead from governmental employees. Over 62,000 federal jobs were cut in February. The upside to the numbers, not to the layoffs, the upside to the numbers is that 34,580, right, private sectors are looking for new workers, and that's up 159% compared to where it was a year ago. So think about that. That's a 159% increase on companies that are looking for employers in February of this year compared to February of last year. 34,580 job openings were announced. So as of February 2025, this is the statistic you have to continue to watch from an economic standpoint, is what is the overall unemployment rate at and where is it headed? Okay. And this is a big piece to continue to track. You hear all these layoffs that just occurred, right? I just said, hey, layoffs were up 245% compared to January to February, but the overall unemployment rate is still only at 4% right now. That's a 0.3% increase from last year at this time when we were at historically low unemployment rates. So as we look through here, this is the unemployment rate over the last 12 months. You can see last May, we were at 3.9%, which is historically low. They would consider that a full labor market still. You can see that it increased upwards of 4.2% in July and September. And right now we're at 4%. Even after that large increase of layoffs that we saw from the economy standpoint, we're still at a 4% unemployment rate, which is still historically low compared to the national average of 5.68%, right? So we're below the historical average. We actually decreased from December 31st of 2024 from 4.1% down to 4%. So even with the layoffs that occurred in there, we're still at 4%, which is it shows how resilient the US economy is, even during times of volatility and even during times where we see an increase in layoffs. And the layoffs are very sector specific right now, that we have been seeing. So all of this information I'm talking about, right, leads me to what have the markets done year to date, right? And this is what we're hearing on the news. We're hearing all this noise, right? It's just white noise happening in the background, and it's hitting you all the time. But what does it mean from a standpoint of markets? When we look through here, you can see the markets year to date. This is the S&P 500, so it's the largest 500 companies in the United States. You can see year to date, the S&P is down 1.81%. This is as of business close yesterday. Okay. At one point, the market was up almost 6% year to date before we saw the volatility creep in with the tariffs. So if we take a step and we bring a microscope and start looking closer at the statistics, you can see the S&P in the past month is actually down 5.31%. And that's what I was referring to. And if you think back, that's right in line when we started to see the layoffs occur and the tariffs get announced. That's that uneasiness that's occurring in the market. So year to date, the S&P is down 1.81, but the past month, the market is down 5.31. Now, I want to remind individuals, especially if you're a client on this call, just because the market's down 6% in a month does not mean you're down 6% in a month. And we're going to talk about that. There's a term that we've used in the past called insulating your assets, and that's diversifying in a way to spread out that risk. And we have a lot of clients that year to date are up 4 or 5, 6% in their accounts, even though the market's down 2, and in the past month, the market's down almost 6. Right? So we're going to talk about ways to insulate through this volatility, but I'm just giving you the statistics here that are driven from a performance standpoint. So S&P the last month's down 5.31. If we look at the Dow is not driven heavily by technology. The Dow would be more of your transportation and staples. It's an index that is also a broad index, but it's only 30 companies. You can see year to date, the Dow is slightly positive, right? It's basically flat. It's positive 0.23% in the first 2 months and 6 days of the year. And you can see, though, the past month, similar. The past month, the Dow is down over 5% since the tariffs have been announced, right? So that creates that same volatility. This is what you're feeling and seeing. And as I said before, if you're in certain sectors, you're going to feel it more than you are in other sectors. So I just gave you all this information, and the question really comes down to what is there to look forward to, right? We're hearing all this noise. We're bombarded, whether you're on one side of the political stance or another, you're bombarded with negative information both ways constantly. So what can we look forward to? Tell me something that we're looking at here at the Trinnell Financial Group. And the next big piece that we're really looking at is the reduction in corporate taxes and tax changes. Okay. And, I live in Wisconsin, so I'm going to use an analogy here. And right now, what's difficult is we're putting the cart in front of the horse. And what's happening is we're seeing all of these tariff changes and impacts that are costing the consumer more money and costing corporations more money, and that creates anxiety. But on the other side of this coin, what they're looking to do is decrease taxes to offset that expense and actually put more profit into the corporate stance and also bring more cash flow into the consumer's pocket, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So currently, corporate rates are at 21%. So back in 2017, there was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed, and that reduced corporate taxes from 35% down to 21%. Okay. What we saw during that time in 2018, the first year that they went through, we saw corporate profits jump by 44 percentage points in 1 year, right? That's huge. They're talking now about lowering that to historically low levels. That would be some of the lowest corporate taxes, not only that the United States has seen, but also in the world. So they're talking about reducing corporate rates from 21% to 15%. That's a 28.5% reduction in taxes on those corporations if they manufacture their products inside the United States. Think about that. So just remove all of the noise and think about that statistic. If you're manufacturing a product in the United States, but let's say that you import one or two of the components that you put into the product from another country, and just those components that you're purchasing, you're getting tariffed on at 25%. Okay. That means that's a 25% increase on just those components that you put into that widget or whatever you're creating. But if you're manufacturing the overall product inside the United States that's made, your taxes go from 21% to 15% on all the revenue that's generated from the sale. That's a 28.5% reduction. That's found revenue that more than outweighs a tariff impact. The issue is this has not passed yet. And if we see it pass, we can be a little bit more optimistic from a standpoint of offsetting that tariff cost. So when we look through this piece, that is why in the first quarter, when you're hearing companies from all over the world, not just United States companies, making investments into the United States to purchase products or build products, it's because they want to take part in that reduced tax bracket. So you think of companies like SoFi, you think of Taiwan Semiconductors, you think of even Apple, right? Apple just did a $500 billion investment into building out facilities inside the United States. They're doing that because they want to take advantage of that 15% rate because it's such a savings to them from a cash flow standpoint. Okay. When we look at just the extension of the tax cuts from 2017, so not even reducing the corporate rate from 21% to 15%, but just extending what was already in place. Because at the end of this year, the the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is set to expire. So if they don't pass a bill, it will go back to a 35% corporate rate instead of 21. The marginal tax brackets for individuals will go up 3 percentage points to what they were back in 2016 by just extending the tax cuts from 2017. You can see the positive impact where my cursor is on GDP. That alone makes a 0.4% increase to GDP by extending that. Now, if we take into account a reduction in taxes from 21% to 15%, it drives GDP even higher because of the found revenue. That is the putting the horse in front of the cart, as I said before, right? That's how they're looking to offset the impact that the tariffs have on the GDP. And you can see on the right-hand side of my screen here, just the increase they're seeing in the long-run GDP by having that reduction in taxes going forward. So that's the outlook they're looking to offset the tariff impact for corporations and also try and keep inflation lower for households. Because in the short term, right, and I think that President Trump, when he did his speech, used the word there could be a short-term disturbance, I think was the word he used. And what he's saying is costs could go up in the short term, and we should anticipate that, right? And we are here, and you should as well anticipate that there would be some short-term increases because of those tariffs on costs of products. Now, as we talked about before, possible tax cuts that are occurring, dropping the corporate rate, and this is the current US law. US currently is at 21% from a corporate rate, and this shows every more of your developed nation's tax code and where they're at and where the United States stacks against other countries. So currently we're at a 21% corporate tax rate. Okay. They're talking about cutting that to 15%. There would only be roughly four nations that have a cheaper corporate tax rate than the United States at that level, right? That is a huge decrease that we've seen. In 2017, when the US cut the corporate rate originally by 14%, so went from 35% to 21%, right? We saw revenue as a share of GDP increase by 40%, right? And if they do that per capita and they say related to individuals, that would have put $1,700 more in individual's pocket from a revenue standpoint from those individual or from those corporations. So that's a 40% increase in revenues that we saw on the original tax cut, right? So that's where you start to see some of the optimistics that can come from looking ahead and saying the reduction in taxes could offset the tariffs and also achieve long-term growth, right? Now, the other piece on here with the tax cuts, and I had a slide created, and what I noticed right when I clicked in that it did not save is I'm talking about corporations right now. And a lot of people say, well, that's corporations, and I get that if they have more profit, that historically the stock price should go up or the dividend should be higher and they're gonna reward the shareholder that way, right? But what about individuals that might not have that stock or might just continue to be working and they're working more paycheck to paycheck? What about those individuals? So what we're also monitoring is some of the other tax proposals they talked about. So what I mean by that is they're talking about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security. The no tax on Social Security part, let's just start with that. So think back, right? Close your eyes, think back to 2020. We're coming out of this horrific time of COVID, and to stimulate the economy, they gave out stimulus checks, right? And certain individuals qualified, households, for $1,200 checks per individual, and they did two rounds of those, right, to stimulate the economy because economists know that if you give Americans as a whole money in their hand, they spend 90 cents out of every dollar, right? They're going to spend it. It sparks growth in the economy, right? And the economy can take off. The thought process behind not taxing Social Security. So let's just use this easy math inside of here. Let's say that the average individual at age 65 is getting somewhere between $2,500 to $3,000 a month in Social Security. Okay, so let's say that a 65-year-old is getting $3,000 a month in Social Security. Maybe they're getting a pension, might be taking some distributions from dividends or IRA accounts, etc. Okay, if they're in a 20% tax bracket, okay, a 20% tax bracket, 85% of your Social Security, if you're above a certain income level, is taxable at the federal level. If they're no longer going to tax Social Security in that example, right, That client, a 20% tax on $36,000, which is $3,000 per month, just received a tax-free windfall of $7,200 back in their pocket, right? 20% of 36,000 is 7,200 bucks. That's a lot of money, right? So we look through that. That also sparks spending and drives economic growth inside of the economy. Now, I'm not sitting here and debating what that does to the deficit because there's other pieces that they have to look through on how they continue to balance the budget. We have $37 trillion in deficit. But from a number standpoint, if they're not taxing Social Security and that is now coming to the individuals tax free, that is a very, very large amount of found cash flow, especially for the older generation, the retirees, the baby boomers, which are the second largest generation in the world, which also would increase spending. What it also does is create a trickle down effect because the second largest generation are the millennials, who are the children of the baby boomers. So when the baby boomers pass away, that now goes to the millennials and they're spending the money because they are receiving the inheritance. So it's a full impact that it needs to be tracked long term. But think of what that stimulus check, one check of $1,200 for the households did to the economy to spark it. If they're freeing up 7,200 a year, that's over, that's roughly $600 a month of extra cash flow going forward. That's huge for the economy. Absolutely huge. Not even talking about not taxing tips, not taxing overtime, etc. So there is some positives behind that from an economic growth standpoint. Okay. Interest rates are something I also want you guys to pay attention to. So interest rates as a whole have continued to stay fairly stagnant the last 3 months. So we saw interest rates increase at the fastest pace in US history. Over the course of 18 months, we saw interest rates increase by almost 5 percentage points. We went from basically zero to, 4 point, I think 55%. So you think about that, that's a huge increase. Typically, the Fed has done that over a 3-year period. They did it in half that time. Fastest increase in US history. So the reason they did that is the economy was overheating and we saw inflation at the highest level we've seen it since the 1970s. So the way you cool inflation, which is totally sounds backwards, but it's the way that it works. The way you cool inflation is you make things more expensive. So if interest rates go higher, now interest on your credit card, interest on your car loan, interest on your mortgage, all of that increases. As that increases, things are more expensive to purchase. You can afford less of that product. Your desire to buy that product comes down. You're no longer purchasing it. Hence, we see the price start to come down, right? What Powell had mentioned in his last speech at the mid-December meeting, December 11th, is he originally was anticipating to cut interest rates in 2025 somewhere between 4 to 6 times. He changed that and said 2 times would most likely be the largest decrease we would see in 2025. So he changed his outlook to be more conservative. And no one should envy his position because if you look at it, his job is to make sure inflation is taken care of. And now we're seeing tariffs announced, and tariffs could lead to short-term inflation, but we're also seeing possible tax cuts, and tax cuts could lead to increased spending, which could lead to inflation. So what they've done is they've chosen to be more conservative and keep interest rates elevated. And the reason they're doing that is because this way they have the ability in the future to cut rates quickly if they need to. If we see volatility and we see the market pull back, they have the ability to cut interest rates quickly to adapt to that. Or if we do see cost of products increase, they've already kept the interest rates at an elevated level and they don't need to move them up dramatically to offset that. So they've chosen that stance of remaining conservative. And we just need to continue to watch that going forward. If we see inflation tick back up, we would see interest rates staying elevated for the foreseeable future before they do decrease. Now, what to know about that is just if you're a person who is risk adverse, there's still some ability to capture some pretty attractive interest rates out there right now with the risk being minimal, right? If you can go get a CD or a T-bill or a treasury and they're paying high interest and you don't like risk, that's an option to look at right now. Also for individuals, if they're looking for some form of pension for themselves or taking advantage of an income benefit inside of an annuity or some type of guarantee product, those payments are locked in at a higher rate right now because they're based off of interest rates. So there's some advantages behind those interest rates being higher, but the disadvantage is interest rates are still high for mortgages, car notes, etc. And those are things that are meant to keep inflation lower. So all of this information we talked about some of the chaos that's occurring, right? With the tariffs, the layoffs, all of the things that we're getting hit with constantly that's creating anxiety. And it's a scary thing, especially with the unknown that comes with it. But there's also some positives there, right? As tax changes occur, that can lead to further economic growth that can offset those tariffs and can also lead to additional revenue for corporations, possibly put more money in individuals' pockets as well. Everyone's sitting here saying, well, how do we be successful, right? What does that look like? And I put bullet points here, and I always do. What we've done here is over the last year, you want to continue to focus on really strong companies, companies that you need to have that product regardless of what's occurring in the marketplace. If you went to your pantry or you went through your house and say, what would I purchase regardless of what's occurring in the market? That's a pretty strong product, right? Is that fair? We would call that more like a recession resistant holding, right? I have to purchase that regardless of how much it costs or where it's at, right? You need to know what you're invested in. So, for example, I'm going to show you a couple examples here in just a second, right? Of understanding what you're invested in. So, if you're invested in a company that generates the majority of their revenue from overseas sales in China or the euro, that's probably a place you do not want to be right now, especially when reciprocal tariffs take place, right? If you're a company that relies on imports from other nations and has no distribution channel inside the United States, that cash flow is going to get hit pretty heavily, right? Meaning the stock price would typically reciprocate that. So you need to understand if you don't know how you're allocated and how that makeup is in place, reach out to us here, reach out to your advisor if you're a client here. We're happy to go through that with you in detail. If you're not a client here and you need some help with that, reach out and we're happy to sit down with you and go through that report. We have a full team that dissects all of that. We need to continue to focus on the longer term, right? We're all stuck right here, right? It's hard to see the forest through the trees. It's hard to get past the noise that's hitting us, but we need to look longer term, right? You know, as Warren Buffett always said, right? Be fearful when others are greedy, be greedy when others are fearful, right? When the noise is the loudest and things seem the most scared, that's typically, right, where people are being more cautious. That's your times to buy. There's going to be opportunities in there to purchase. Continue to add to accounts, right? And what I mean by that is that's called dollar cost averaging. Just because there's noise that's occurring, don't stop putting in your 401k. Don't stop making contributions, right? Even if we see the market go down 10%, you're going to be happy you put money in because the assets are there. And long term, you have more assets in the account growing. You're never going to be able to perfectly time the market. No one is. And if they tell you they can, they're lying to you, right? Continue to add money to the account systematically. Insulate your accounts. Okay. So insulate your income. So if you're a retiree and you're looking to draw income and you're taking a 4% distribution rate and you're getting a dividend of 4%, right? You don't need the portfolio to grow. So all this volatility is white noise, and over time, you know you're in a good company and that company is going to be bigger, but the dividend is covering the distribution you're taking, right? You're receiving what the investment is giving you without selling any of your principal shares. So over time, those shares can get bigger. Insulate yourself. I talked about it before with income protection. Interest rates are higher. Look at some opportunities with interest rates being higher to say, how can I protect my income going forward? You need to assess what is the income now versus growth later and have clear expectations on how they should perform. If you're looking for income now off of a portfolio, investing in penny stocks or high flying technology companies that don't pay a dividend, that's not the right expectation, right? If you're investing for growth later, that's something where you're saying, hey, I'm investing for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. This volatility, yes, is uncomfortable, but I'm confident that this company here is going to be worth X later on, and it's something bigger and substantially larger than what it is today. So you need to assess your goals and make sure you're investing accordingly for those. And then continue to be in it for the long term, right? Continue to position yourself that says we're going to be best successful with what we're currently doing long term, not only from a tax strategy, but from a risk strategy and from a return strategy, right? So all of those need to be accounted for inside of there. Just because the market's down, right? Just because the market's down does not mean that you're down. And the reason I show this, and I can show you countless off of these, okay? I put the numbers out of here just because these are portfolios that we're working for actual clients. So I can't show any client data, right, inside of there, but I highlighted the return there over the last quarter. This is year to date. So as I said before, the S&P is down about 1.81% year to date, not including today. The Dow is flat year to date. The S&P in the last 1 month is down about 6.6% and change. The Dow is down 5.05%. You can see that insulating the portfolio to invest in good, solid companies, and you remove the risk of the tariff, you remove the risks that are in place by spreading that out amongst multiple sectors, you can see that you can remove that volatility. This green line that you see here, right, is the performance of the account from December, January, February, and March. 3, 4, 5, 6%, just like I was talking before, without having those big volatile swings that are occurring with the tariffs. I just sat down with a client yesterday, and I don't know if they're on this call or not, and she was extremely nervous. And she's like, I don't even want to look. I haven't looked at a statement in 2 months. I'm extremely nervous. And I said, you're doing extremely well. And I said, it was the changes we made a year ago to position because the tariffs were coming, right? That are boding well. And I showed her, and she was up over 4% year to date. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." She had been watching the news. She heard the S&P was down dramatically over the last month, and she was boding quite well from it. So key takeaways. Short term, we need to be realistic. Short term volatility, right? There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of noise that's occurring, right? There's tariffs. There's things that are going to shake the overall economy in the short term. We need to be realistic. Long term, though, we need to stay optimistic. We're the greatest country in the world. We're the largest economy in the world, right? There's a lot of change that's occurring. Long term, you need to look at the investments you hold and say, are they a good company? Are they going to be bigger in the future? And we need to remain optimistic. We need to continue to take advantage of assets differently. So if there's assets out there that we should be utilizing to hedge and take advantage of volatility, we want to do it, right? Insulate your cash flow through your dividends, as we had talked about before. That removes the need for worrying of the market volatility, and then know and understand what you're invested. So as I had talked about before, if you have questions, please reach out to our team. We're happy to go through those in detail. If you're new to the Trinnell Financial Group and you have questions, like to sit down with one of our team members, please, by all means, reach out to us. We're happy to go through this. This is a time of uncertainty, so we're happy to dive through that and make sure that you have that clarity and confidence going forward. With that being said, I'm going to turn this over and see, Jenna, was there any questions that we wanted to dive through? I don't know if we have any time or not. I went a little bit longer than I normally do.
That's okay. You still did a phenomenal job. I have a couple of questions on here that we can go through. The first one is, how much of what you see nationally is just show business, political theater, or even a circus, not really any true lasting fundamental effective policy change or common sense wrestling with our deep budgetary challenges? Is it hard to have an investment practice not having a true idea of where it's going, or is it just the patience aspect? I love this question, by the way.
That is a strong question. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of theatrics that occur in politics. I think all of us know, if anyone watched the presidential address earlier this week, you saw all kinds of theatrics from both parties. I think there was a person removed, there were signs being held up, there were people pulling signs from the other side of the aisle. I mean, it's theatrics, right? And honestly, this is my opinion, it was like watching children sit there and argue with each other. It's ridiculous, right? So there's plenty of theatrics that are occurring. Some of what you're seeing are fundamental changes right,
Mhm.
to the overall economy. Tariffs are a fundamental change. Now, if tariffs are a negotiating tool and they're a short-term tool that's used to negotiate a new deal, that's one thing. If we're seeing tariffs that are here to stay long term, you're going to see companies completely change their distribution channels, where they buy products for, how they manufacture products. And then tax law changes also are a large fundamental change to the United States citizens, right? In corporations. So if tax law changes occur and the new corporate rate is 15% and that is solidified, most likely we would see a larger investment in the United States in certain sectors, which we have started to see
Mhm.
some of that already,
Mhm.
um, which could lead to further profits there. But there's a lot that goes into that, and there's a lot of unknowns. So it's just knowing what companies are going to be impacted at certain times that we have to pay attention to in the short term.
Absolutely. That was a great answer, Tyler.
Thank you.
So the next one, tariffs caused Apple to invest billions, producing over projected 1,000 new jobs in North Carolina alone. This will repeat itself with another high-tech company like Chips. Doesn't this offset the negative tariff effects?
It could. So what tariffs are doing is tariffs force some of this to happen faster, right? So you think about it from a company standpoint, they're saying if I am importing a lot of my products or selling a lot of products to the United States, so take Taiwan Semiconductors, for example. They sell a lot of their chips to the United States, right? Because we are one of the largest countries innovating in AI, and we need their chips, right? Their technology format to
Mhm.
continue that AI structure. So they're saying rather than take the hit and pay the tariff, we're just going to bite the bullet and we're going to invest in a manufacturing company inside the United States to avoid that tariff, right? So they're
Mhm.
working around it. So the tariffs did force some of that. There's certain countries and companies that cannot change their distribution channels to actually accommodate for that. And those
Mhm.
are the ones that are going to get hit substantially harder. So does it fully offset the tariffs? For that company, it does, right? But other companies that might not be doing that, it wouldn't, right? So it is truly a company by company standpoint of how they're going to work through that distribution channel, especially in the short term.
Okay. Okay. So the next question I like a lot. It says, if unemployment is so low and tariffs are short-term concerns, then why am I seeing such a high increase in my own personal costs, i.e., healthcare is up 40%,
Yeah.
homeowners, car insurance, groceries, doctor fees, all of that, like up 20 to 25%, which I do like this question a lot.
Yeah, inflation as a whole is just ridiculous for the consumer. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So insurance, let's start with that. Insurance as a whole is just going to continue to go up. You look at,
Right.
the insurance is pooled risk. So if you have a hailstorm go through, and let's say your house was spared, but 14 of your neighbors were hit, the cost of insurance in your area just went up exponentially because the insurance companies just had to pay out on 14 houses. So it's pooled risk. You're in a risk area, right? That's why you see like even Florida is requiring flood insurance. But you're like, I'm on the highest point. It would not flood here. Yeah, well, 20 of your neighbors flooded out and it's pooled
Hmm.
risk, and they're going to make everybody pay for that risk. So that's the cost of insurance. We'll see that more with the fires that have occurred, hurricanes, tornadoes, all of the catastrophic events we've seen from a weather standpoint. Insurance is one of those pieces that it's hard to say where they're going to cap that or how they're going to cap that.
Right.
From a standpoint on the tariffs, where it comes short term is you have to look at where we imported our goods until the distribution channels change. So, for example, the Midwest as well as Northeast United States, we purchase the majority of our oil from Canada and it's refined and used in those states. So, if we see an increase, and I think it was a 10% tariff that was put on that oil, that means we're paying 10% more. We're going to feel that at the pump short term until there's a new distribution channel to offset that.
Hmm.
Similar with lumber, we import a lot of lumber from Canada, a lot of aluminum and steel. We've already seen steel futures jump almost 30%, right? So those are things that you're going to feel in the short term until another provider or company comes in and says, we're going to do it cheaper or manufacture it here in the United States to offset that. A lot of that is getting baked in. We saw steel futures jump before the actual tariffs took place because it's not just going to happen on day one, right? So a lot of that cost was
Right.
getting built in across there. Healthcare is ridiculously expensive. And I wish I could
Mhm.
give you a better answer than if you look at the historical rolling annual total, it is a straight line upward on healthcare because of the expenses that are in place. Um,
Mhm.
that's just, I mean,
Yeah.
it goes up regardless of what's occurring with tariffs and so forth.
Absolutely. Okay, that was a great answer. Thank you. The next question that I have, so I have about 2 or 3 more questions on here just because we're coming
Let's
up
ju-
on time.
yeah, let's just do two more, Jen, and then we can email the others just for
That's
time.
perfect. That's perfect. One of the questions, I do like this question. It says, will the tax credit offset the labor cost difference between the US and China, for example?
Can you read it one more time, Jenna?
Will the tax credit offset the labor cost difference between the US and China,
You know, that's a
example?
great question. Certain
Hmm.
sectors, absolutely not. Right? I mean, you look at it, there was I was watching a podcast done and they held up a phone and they said, do you know how much it costs to make an iPhone 14 in China? And everybody guessed and it cost $10, right? $10. We cannot make an iPhone 14 in the United States with the regulations we have, the labor costs we have, minimum wage, all those different pieces,
Right.
insurance restrictions, right? But we're so blessed to have those, right? And that's the thing. We make 4 times the amount, from a standpoint, even in the military, our military personnel makes 4 times the amount of a Chinese military individual, right? We're so blessed to have that ability that no, in certain areas, especially manufacturing certain products, that's just not where we're going to be able to accelerate. Now,
Right.
the advances of artificial intelligence could change that. That absolutely could change that, right? If you have a
Hmm.
machine that can pump out a phone and there's nothing else included, and I'm not here to negotiate or to, talk about, labor and machines taking
Hmm.
over jobs and so forth. But if artificial intelligence were to a point where they could create the whole thing and create it faster, then it does reduce that cost. So there
Right.
is part of that piece that's in that negotiation. But if you're talking just man hours, no, we can't compete with them, right?
Right.
They do not take care of their people nowhere near what the United States is doing.
Right. Absolutely. All right. The last question that I think is appropriate for this is, where do you see CD rates going?
Short term, I think they'll stay the same. Long term, they're going to come down. I mean,
Okay.
if we see economic growth, we would see we would see interest rates normalize and levelize if we bring down the national debt, like they're looking to do from decreasing the deficit. The deficit will bring the yield curve down further. As the yield curve comes down, interest rates will follow. So I do think longer term it'll drop a bit from where it is right now, but short term I think it'll be comparable to where it's at right now.
Okay. Well, that's awesome. We will respond back to everyone else individually for the questions that they asked.
Appreciate it. Thanks everybody. Have a great
Awesome.
day.
Thank you, Tyler. You did great. Awesome.